Today on Online for Authors, I'm chatting with Lorraine Norwood, author of The Solitary Sparrow. Welcome, Lorraine.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I am so excited to have you. Before we really get into this discussion, can you let readers know what they're going to find when they open up the pages of Solitary Sparrow?
Well, one of the things you'll see first is a map, a hand-drawn map of the village where the protagonist grows up. And I knew from the outset, years and years ago, that I wanted a map in it.
Okay.
And I was just thrilled to find this man online who could do maps. And not only that, he lived in the UK and had done maps for other people. And so once, we got through to each other, and I got a contract to him and everything. And he sent me a note about the mill and how the mill should be drawn and the pond. And he said, I don't mean to cause any problems, but the pond is really on the wrong side. And I was like, whoa, you put it where you think it goes,
Exactly.
And I knew he was perfect at that point. So,
absolutely.
So you'll find the map, and then the way it's formatted and put together, you will note that each chapter tells you the date, the time, the place, so that you're grounded in that chapter. You know who it is and what's going to happen. And also there's some little bit, some design things that we decided to put in there. I wanted it to be aesthetically very nice. I wanted it to be easy for the reader to find his way around.
Right.
And I purposely made the chapters short so that readers who don't have a lot of time to read, or moms who are reading after a long day, can read a little bit and feel that they're still in the story, and they've left at a point that something is going to happen and they can jump back in.
Right. I loved all of those things about the book, because I'm often reading it. Yeah. Well, I'm often reading at night, and all of a sudden I can feel that I'm getting tired, and I always flip real fast to see like how many more pages for the chapter. And it's nice to think, oh, 2, I can do 2. I can make myself stay awake. You get, and it's like 8, 9. No, I'm never going to make it. I need to go to sleep now. So. Right. So why did you choose 14th century England and France as your place to write a book?
Well, about halfway through writing the book, I'm going, why did I choose the 14th century? Why am I writing historical fiction? Because my writer friends were already on their second, third, fourth book, and they were writing these wonderful contemporary books that had beautiful covers and lots of colors, and maybe a couple of really high stiletto heels, and some titles that were so clever. And I'm thinking, number one, I can't think of titles like that. And I've tried to write that kind of book, and it comes out ridiculously horrible. It's just not me.
It's not where you are. So,
no.
So did you know a lot about this period before you got started?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I've been hooked on the medieval period since I was 11 years old.
Okay.
And it took it even further. 20 years ago, I went to graduate school in the UK. And In fact, I had my 50th birthday in graduate school, and got a graduate degree in medieval archaeology. So added some more things to learn about. But I don't know why I'm so entranced by this period. I think maybe I was born in the wrong country in the wrong
The wrong
century.
time. Yeah. I know sometimes it does feel that way. So as you're doing the research, because even though you have a degree in this era, I'm sure there was a lot of research. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about the types of research that you did, and then why don't maybe like something super interesting that you learned while doing the research for this book?
Okay. I love research. It's the bane of my existence and also the thing I love to do the most.
Yeah.
If I could find somebody who would just pay me to do research, then I would just be thrilled. It's a problem because, those rabbit holes are really deep and
They
they're
are.
time suckers.
Yeah.
And so, and also I have 4 or 5 bookcases full of books. And I decided I would stop ordering more books when I realized, as I got a book from Amazon and put it up on the bookshelf, that I already had that book.
No.
Well, I think it's time to stop ordering. But the internet has only made it worse, because now if I'm writing and I have my character sit under a tree, I want to know what kind of tree it is, and was
Right.
that tree indigenous to the UK or France or Germany, wherever I am, and what does it look like, and what time of year is it? And so it I could just say she was sitting under a tree, but for some reason, I just want the details, because I think the details in the world building really make the book and make it stand apart from a lot of historical fiction where the author has not done a lot of research.
Right, right. One of the things that I find difficult about doing the research is knowing when I've done enough.
Right.
Because like you said, the rabbit holes, and you can go down them. And I always end up with so much more information than I can possibly put in the book. And then you have to go through and pick out, okay, now which of these pieces of information are going to move my story along and help the reader get a real feel for where we are and why we're here.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I might, for instance, right now I'm working on the second book, and Edward III and his wife, Queen Philippa, figure in this book with the main character. And so I've got a couple of books that are biographies of him. Well, I might read that book and use only 3 things out of the book.
Exactly.
So I feel, though, that it's not a waste of my time, because it gives me the feel of this character in a way that makes him become real on the page. He's not just a cardboard king, and he's there warts and all. And so I don't mind reading through the books to get there. And you had asked me about something that I researched that I hadn't known about.
Right.
I'm going to have this in my next newsletter, but I came across an academic, not argument, but heated discussion about whether or not women in the medieval period wore underwear. There doesn't seem to be any. Of course, there's no art, because they would not have painted women in their underwear. Now there are some art pieces that show men in their underwear, particularly if they're peasants and they're out getting in the hay. But for women, it's always been a question. Then archaeologically, two bras made of cloth were discovered in Germany, and they were in anaerobic conditions, so they're in perfect condition. They're a little ratty looking. I wouldn't wear them, but they're definitely, you can look at those and know that they were bras. So that indicates that maybe there was something that they used. But as to underpants,
there's no way to know, huh?
nothing. And some academics actually say that they didn't wear any. And my answer to that was, you've got to be kidding me. That's ridiculous. Knowing the needs of women, of course they wore something. It may not look like, Victoria's Secret, but it was
certainly they had something going, right?
Absolutely.
Right. I think that's interesting. So my latest book, Daughters of Green Mountain Gap, also discusses medical care in the mountains of North Carolina, where you live, in the 1890s. And I found it interesting that there were some similarities between the medicine from your Meg and the medicine from my Maggie, especially that women without any formal education were dealing with birth and other women issues, which was something that was just very common. But you have your Meg attend a college, although with a twist. How likely is that to have been able to happen for a woman to have attended a university like that?
Right. Not at all likely in England. Women were forbidden to attend university. However, in Italy, in Salerno, they were able to attend. And not only that, some of the professors were women. And one woman in particular, Trotula, or Trotta, was very famous. This was in the 1100s.
Wow. Okay.
But in France, where she ends up in the last third of the book, women were not allowed. And she tries very hard to get in, but she falls afoul of the patriarchy. Yep. And then she makes a fatal mistake, and she is
kicked out.
She's not wanted.
She's
not
no
wanted
longer,
because of her gender, her sex.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And like I said, I found it really interesting that, 1400s to almost 1900s, we're talking, 450 to 500 years. And in some sense, there was not a lot of advancement in that period of time. No. There was some. I mean, by the 1890s, Florence Nightingale had come. We now knew a little bit more about, things like hand washing and, washing medical tools after use and not just using them from one patient to the next. A few things, but generally the way medicine was practiced had not changed much in those 500 years. And I found that that very remarkable, because if you look from the 1890s to present, we have had huge, remarkable changes in that period of time. And yet the 500 years before that, there were a few little things. I mean, that germ theory is a big thing, but in terms of how they actually practiced, there wasn't a lot of changes going on in that period of time.
Absolutely, you're right. And a lot of it was because they put a huge amount of emphasis on what they called the ancients, Galen, Hippocrates, and some Arabic physicians. And they had the books, and of course the books had to be copied by hand. So that was so laborious. They were very expensive. And so medicine, a lot of medicine was word of mouth. It was an
Exactly.
oral tradition. And then if you count the fact that women's care was seen as only for women and women only.
Right.
It was, even though childbirth was the leading killer of women, it was still the midwife and the neighbors, the relatives, helping the woman. And because they weren't allowed in university, because they weren't taught even the ancient books, a lot of it was just mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor.
Right.
And it might even have been left over in England from the Anglo-Saxon period. So it was a very slow grind toward the modern medicine we have today. And
Right.
another thing is they didn't do dissections.
Yeah, that was an interesting part of the book. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, and that is going to be a big topic in the second book, because Meg is going to be part of a dissection in Montpellier, where was going to university, and they would only have the dissections about once every 2 years. And sometimes they weren't even on the human body, they were on pigs, because pigs were thought to be similar to the human body. So it was, I mean, I'm reading along and I can't help but laugh or chuckle at some of the things that were taken seriously. But who knows 1,000 years from now what physicians will look back on and go, oh,
Exactly.
I can't believe that care was so barbaric. That
Well,
was horrible.
Well, for instance, my husband has cancer and
Mm-hmm.
he's had to do chemotherapy. And I know that will be one of the things that people look at and say,
I
how
do too.
barbaric that we gave people poison in hopes that it would kill the bad and the
Yes.
good would grow back before the bad did. Like
Yes.
when you think about it in those kinds of terms, it's as bad as bloodletting and other horrible things, right? And so I've said that a lot of times, like that's going to be one of the ones we look at and go, you've got to be kidding. They did what? Really? This is what they did? And now with more and more that we're able to do with nerve regeneration and other things, I think even a lot of amputations and things are going to be looked at as totally grotesque. Because I think there's going to be more and more that they can do to save limbs and to reattach and to do things that they couldn't do before.
Oh, yes. And that's true of the time period that I'm in, 1306 to 1348. They were doing amputations in that time period. But the problem that they ran into was there was no germ theory. They knew that the limb got it had pus, for instance. But was it the good pus or the bad pus? There was an actual argument over that among physicians. And so they certainly knew what gangrene was. And once that set in, how you could just kiss it all goodbye because you were done for.
Well, they didn't have the antibiotics and the other things that could help people with all of that. Right. In a lot of ways, when we see Meg and the people that are teaching her, there are some things that are a little advanced, like you said, the dissections and other things where she gets to know the internal parts of a body, whereas people who are teaching her don't know. Right. They're not even necessarily sure what's next to what and how it all connects on the inside.
Exactly.
And then on the other hand, there are things that are, barbaric in our terms. that we see them doing. And I think you're right that, 150 years from now, people will look back and there will be a whole line of things that they talk about and say, I can't believe they used to do that. So,
yes. Bloodletting was
yeah.
one of those where we think, what were they thinking? Because sometimes if the patient seemed to be failing, perhaps from our perspective, maybe they had anemia.
Yeah,
Or maybe
let's take some more of their blood,
yes,
right?
let's take, exactly. And cupping was another thing, particularly for women. But nuns would have, especially in the spring, would have physicians come in, and they would do bloodletting so that they could all feel better.
Right.
And I think, in a way, if you kind of move ahead a couple of hundred years, that's kind of like my mother said that when she was a little girl, she was always given castor oil in the spring because that was supposed to make you feel better and kind of refreshed and ready for the spring and summer. It got the bad stuff of winter out of you.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It is crazy. Well, and bloodletting was still going on in my book in the 1890s. That was still one of the preferred treatments for diabetes.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that.
All the way into the
Wow.
1890s, they were still doing bloodletting for diabetics.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you think about that and it's like, oh, that's like one of the worst things you could be doing. And yet it was the thing. I mean, I'm sure that during the time period that you're talking about, there was the whole idea where you could put herbs and other things in a mask, and then that mask would keep you safe from the bad elements,
Exactly.
right? That were floating around.
Right.
The mask was probably the closest thing they had to the right idea, but the herbs weren't doing anything for them.
No. And once bubonic plague hit, which is going to be in my third book, they didn't know anything about germ theory, but they kind of knew that if you got out of town,
yes,
maybe you wouldn't get so sick.
They called it bad air. I mean, it was like, ooh, that's bad air, and they would find a way to get away from the bad air, right?
Right. It was miasma.
Yeah.
And once the miasma came in, you kept your doors and windows closed. The Pope had a fire burning constantly 24/7. The rich people did leave town.
Yeah.
But they had other houses and places to go to. The poor, unfortunately, didn't have that.
Well, and of course, the poor are also closer together.
Absolutely.
They're living in more crowded conditions, et cetera. And so it's going to be even worse. They're less likely to have bathed any time recently. They're more likely to be eating food that doesn't have as much nourishment, all of the things that make disease spread worse.
Exactly. Not to mention the rats.
Right.
So
Exactly. So you've brought up book 2 and book 3, and if I remember correctly, there's going to be 4. So can you give us maybe just a quick little, like, what are we going to find in these books? Are we going to still be following Meg? Is she in all of them? And kind of like, what are some things that we might see along the way?
Well, this began as a standalone book. And it's like if you've ever baked your own bread, which I have, and they came out like hockey pucks, but you have to knock it down. It rises, and then you knock it down.
Yeah.
And you're just kneading it and everything. And my book got to be like that bread diet, and the more I knocked it down, the bigger it got. And so I said, well, okay, maybe I can make this, make it a trilogy. And then I realized that there was an area in book one that I had trouble with it for years, and I couldn't figure out how to fix it. And it just didn't ring true to me. There was a modern character in it, and it was a dual timeline, which, by the way, don't ever try to do that. It is very hard. And I had them interwoven with each other. Meg just was singing off the page. She was right there, and she was fabulous. The modern character was flat, and I knew it, but I didn't know how to handle it. A developmental editor who was so good told me that I needed to consider taking that modern character out. And I was like, oh no, I can't do that, But I had other people tell me that as well. Publishers who had read the book and said, we love the writing, we just don't think that this dual timeline is feasible. So one Friday, after I talked to that developmental editor, I said, all right, she's going. I sat down and I cut out 40,000 words. And Elspeth went away. But the more I started thinking about books 1, 2, and 3, which are all Meg, all set in this time period of 1306 to 1348, but it's Meg's journey through the time period, trying to become a doctor of physics to women who are dying by the thousands because there's nobody caring for them other than an illiterate midwife. And her journey to become that is captured in the first 3 books. And then Elspeth, the modern character, is in the 4th book. She finds the book that Meg has been writing through my books 1 through 3 and brings this forgotten woman to life in today's time period.
Oh, how fun. That does so that was a great way to do your dual timeline without making it dual. It was like, oh good, now I can just focus on the one character. I love that. Oh, that is fabulous.
I even sometimes now I'm like, oh my God, was that the right thing to do? But I have a very dear friend. We've been friends since we were 11 years old, and she is a voracious reader. And she texted me the other day and said, I'm so mad I threw this book across the room. And it was a dual timeline. She couldn't keep track of who, what, and where. And and who was speaking in each chapter, and it really frustrated her, and it made her feel like a dummy, and so she didn't finish it. And I thought, yep, I know the feeling, so I'm glad.
I mean, I think dual timelines can be done well. You just have to really work hard at it, and there has to be a real good reason for it to be happening,
right?
If you're just doing dual timeline because it sounds like a cool thing to do, it probably doesn't work as well. If you have a really good reason as to what is going on and why this is happening this way. My second book has a dual timeline, but they're not super far. The character is 4 years old in the World War II era part, and he is an old man in his 70s, and he does a lot of recollection. And so you see him on one day, he is, it's Veterans Day, and he's thinking about his dad. And it bounces between him and what he's doing that day in remembrance of his father, then back to the memories. That one works a little better because at least the character is really in both, and you just see him as an older man and as a child. But it is hard to do. They're very difficult to manage that way.
Right. I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got these 4 in your mind. Are you like me where you have a whole list of other books that are dying to come out? Yeah.
Yes. And I also have other books that I wrote that I thought were, it's a great idea at the time. And then I got in the middle and I didn't know where I was going.
Where to go. Yeah.
And those are filed away for later.
Because they might come out. So by saying that, I'm assuming then that you're more of a pantser instead of a plotter, where you just write and see where it goes, or do you plot?
Well, those were early books, and at that point I was a pantser.
Okay.
Now I'm a plotter to the nth degree.
Are you?
Yeah, I need to know where I'm going. I need to do chapter and scene. I've already got the end of the book written, so I know where I'm going. I've just got to get there.
Just got to get there. Absolutely. So, hey guys, if you want to continue this conversation, head on over to Novels and Latte Book Club on Facebook. There you're going to have the opportunity to win Lorraine's book, The Solitary Sparrow. So find the post, tell us something you liked or learned while listening to this podcast, and you'll have that opportunity to win the book. So Lorraine, if someone wanted to get up with you to talk with you about your books or about your writing style or about the Solitary Sparrow and some of the cool things that they learned, how can they do that?
Well, they're certainly welcome to email me. It's S as in Susan, Lorraine Norwood @gmail.com.
Okay.
And I would love to hear from people and hear their ideas and their questions. I'd also love to go to book clubs, even Zooming to book clubs, because it's always so interesting to me, the different ways that people see books and what they get out of different characters. It may be so different than what I intended, but when they bring it up, I realize, that's a really good point. So
it's kind of like going to the English class where they said, what did the author mean, except that you get to have the author there and ask them, what did you really mean, right?
Exactly. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, Pinterest. So
super. I'll have those links in the show notes, guys. So head right on out, buy Lorraine's book, The Solitary Sparrow. It's wonderful. I enjoyed it thoroughly. And Lorraine, I want to thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, thank you, Terry. This has been great. I've enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.